The laughter began before the announcement had fully settled into the room. It rippled across the long table of polished walnut, bounced off crystal glasses and silk curtains, and landed like dust on the shoulders of everyone present. Victor Hale stood at the head of the table, calm, immovable, his silver hair catching the chandelier light. He waited until the noise thinned, until curiosity replaced mockery. "My son will marry Elena," he said evenly. "The wedding will be next month." For a moment there was silence, then disbelief. Someone coughed. Someone else smiled too widely. Across the table, Marcus Bell, Victor's oldest competitor, leaned back in his chair and laughed openly. "The cleaner," Marcus said. "You mean the woman who empties trash cans on the executive floor?" Elena stood near the doorway, hands folded tightly in front of her uniform. She had been told to attend only to pour coffee, to remain invisible as she always had. She had not been told her life would be named aloud like a rumor. Her face burned, but she did not look away. Victor's son, Daniel, felt the heat of every gaze turned toward him. He was 30, educated in Europe, groomed for leadership, and suddenly reduced to a spectacle. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. His father's expression warned him not to interrupt. "Yes," Victor said, "that Elena." The room erupted again. Jokes followed. Some sharp, some careless, all cruel. Talk of charity weddings, of publicity stunts, of a powerful man losing his grip. Victor listened without reacting. Elena listened too, memorizing each voice, each sneer, not with anger but with a quiet resolve she did not yet fully understand. The weeks that followed were relentless. Society columns speculated wildly. Business partners called Victor in private, advising him to reconsider, to protect the brand. Marcus Bell's company leaked a story implying Victor was unwell, that the marriage was proof of instability. Daniel found himself trapped between embarrassment and a growing, unexpected protectiveness toward the woman everyone despised on his behalf. Elena moved into the Hale estate with a single suitcase. The house was larger than the apartment building she had grown up in. The staff watched her with curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. She thanked everyone, asked questions, learned routines. At night, alone in a guest room that felt like a museum, she reread old notebooks filled with numbers, sketches, ideas she had never shown anyone. Cleaning had paid the bills. Thinking had always been her refuge. Daniel tried, awkwardly, to bridge the distance between them. Their conversations were polite, cautious. He expected resentment. He found patience. He expected insecurity. He found steadiness. Elena did not ask for favors or reassurance. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was with surprising clarity. The wedding was small by Victor's standards, extravagant by Elena's. Cameras flashed. Smiles were practiced. Marcus Bell attended and congratulated Victor loudly, as if the whole thing were an elaborate joke he was enjoying. Elena walked down the aisle with her head high, her borrowed dress fitting him perfectly but worn with dignity. Daniel realized, as he watched her, that he wanted to deserve that calm. Married life was not a fairy tale. Elena was excluded from meetings, from social events, from casual respect. Invitations arrived addressed only to Daniel. Comments were made as if she were not present. Once, at a gala, a woman mistook Elena for staff and handed her an empty glass. Elena took it, smiled, and later calmly explained the error to the woman's husband, who happened to be a major investor. The apology was immediate. The respect was reluctant, but real. At the company, trouble was brewing. Victor's empire, built on logistics and manufacturing, faced a sudden supply chain disruption. Costs soared. Contracts slipped away. Advisors argued. Solutions were recycled and ineffective. One evening, Daniel came home exhausted, papers spilling from his briefcase. Elena brought him tea and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "May I look?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. She read quietly, tracing routes with her finger, calculating in her head. After a long moment, she asked questions, simple ones at first, then sharper. Why this supplier? Why this port? Why not stagger deliveries? Daniel frowned, then leaned closer. Elena pulled out one of her old notebooks and began to sketch. She proposed rerouting, renegotiating with smaller regional partners, adjusting inventory timing. It was not revolutionary. It was practical. It was efficient. Daniel stared at the page, then at her. Where did you learn this? He asked. Watching, she said. Listening. Cleaning offices teaches you a lot. People talk when they think you don't matter. The plan worked. Within weeks, losses slowed. Within months, profits stabilized. Victor asked to meet with Elena privately. She entered his study with the same composure she had shown on the day of the announcement. I knew you were capable, Victor said. I did not know how capable. Word spread, slowly at first. Elena began attending meetings. Some resisted. Some scoffed. Marcus Bell dismissed her ideas publicly, until one of them undercut his own expansion strategy and won Hale Industries a crucial contract. The laughter stopped. The whispers changed tone. At a major industry conference, Elena stood beside Daniel as an equal. She spoke about efficiency, about valuing overlooked labor, about seeing systems instead of symbols. The room listened. Marcus watched from the back, jaw tight, realizing too late that the joke had never been on Victor, it had been on him. Months later, as Hale Industries announced its strongest quarter in years, headlines shifted. The narrative was no longer scandal but strategy. Vision. Foresight. Photos of Elena appeared, no longer in uniform but still unmistakably herself. At a private dinner, Marcus raised a glass toward Victor, forced smile in place. You were right, he said. We underestimated her. Victor glanced at Elena, then at his son, who stood taller than he ever had before. Yes, Victor replied. You did. Elena did not smile in triumph. She simply took Daniel's hand, grounded and steady, knowing that envy was loud, but respect, real respect, was earned quietly. Over time the laughter began as a murmur and swelled into something sharp and careless, the kind that filled space too easily. It slid across the long dining table, clinked against crystal glasses, and settled into the corners of the room like dust no one bothered to clean. Victor Hale stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He waited. He had learned long ago that silence, when used deliberately, could be louder than shouting. My son will marry Elena, he said at last, his voice steady and unraised. The wedding will take place next month. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then disbelief cracked it open. The cleaner, someone said, not bothering to lower their voice. Marcus Bell, Victor's most persistent rival, leaned back in his chair, laughter spilling freely from his mouth. This is a joke, right? You're talking about the woman who cleans the executive restrooms. Elena stood near the doorway, a tray of coffee cups balanced in her hands. She had been told to wait there, to step in only if needed. She had not been warned that her name would be spoken as if it were a punchline. Her fingers tightened around the tray, but she did not flinch. Years of being unseen had taught her how to stand still under scrutiny. Yes, Victor replied calmly. That Elena. The laughter returned, louder now, emboldened. People exchanged glances heavy with amusement and judgment. A few looked toward Daniel, Victor's son, expecting him to protest, to look embarrassed, to deny it. Daniel felt his face heat as every eye turned toward him. He had known about the arrangement for weeks, yet the public exposure made it feel unreal, like a poorly timed dream. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His father's gaze met his for just a moment, firm, unyielding. Daniel swallowed and said nothing. Elena lowered her eyes, not in shame but in focus. She memorized the room. The polished shoes, the expensive watches, the careless cruelty that came so easily to people who had never been small. When Victor dismissed the meeting, she moved quietly, setting cups down where they belonged, doing her job as if her life had not just been rearranged in front of an audience. The days that followed were worse than the announcement. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. Industry blogs speculated that Victor Hale had lost his judgment. Society pages framed the engagement as either a scandal or a publicity stunt. Competitors whispered about instability at the top of Hale Industries. Marcus Bell's company leaked an anonymous concern about Victor's health, carefully worded to sound sympathetic. Daniel felt the pressure everywhere, at work, at social events, even in his own home. Friends asked if he was being forced. Distant relatives called to offer advice he had not requested. He found himself defending a decision he had not fully chosen, yet could no longer imagine undoing. Elena moved into the Hale estate with one small suitcase and a careful heart. The house was vast, filled with rooms that echoed when she walked through them. The staff watched her with polite curiosity and thinly disguised doubt. Some were kind, others were cold. She thanked everyone, learned names, asked questions. She refused to act smaller than she was, but she did not demand space either. She simply occupied it. At night, alone in a guest room that felt more like a hotel than a home, she unpacked notebooks she had kept for years. They were filled with scribbled observations, diagrams, numbers written during lunch breaks and late nights. She had always watched how things moved: people, supplies, information. Cleaning offices had given her access to conversations never meant for her ears. She had listened. She had learned. Daniel tried to talk to her, unsure of where to begin. Their conversations were cautious at first, like two people navigating unfamiliar terrain. He expected resentment, perhaps fear. What he found instead was quiet patience. "I know this isn't easy," he said one evening, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the sitting room. She looked up from the book she was reading. "No," she agreed, but easy was never promised. There was no accusation in her tone, no plea. It unsettled him more than anger would have. The wedding arrived quickly. It was smaller than Victor's usual standards, but still more extravagant than anything Elena had imagined. Cameras flashed. Smiles were worn like masks. Guests whispered behind gloved hands. Marcus Bell attended and congratulated Victor with theatrical warmth, his eyes glittering with amusement. Elena walked down the aisle in a borrowed dress that fit imperfectly but was worn with quiet dignity. Daniel watched her and felt something shift inside him, not passion, not yet, but respect, solid and grounding. When she reached his side, she met his eyes steadily, as if reminding him that they were standing there. Together. Married life was not a transformation, it was a test. Elena found herself excluded from conversations and events without explanation. Invitations arrived addressed only to Daniel. At galas, people spoke around her as if she were furniture. Once, a woman handed her an empty glass and asked for champagne without looking up. Elena took the glass, smiled, and later calmly introduced herself to the woman's husband, who happened to be negotiating a major contract with Hale Industries. The apology was swift. The embarrassment lingered. At the company, trouble began to surface. A supply chain disruption hit hard and fast. Delays multiplied. Costs rose. Contracts wavered. Advisors argued in circles, proposing solutions that looked impressive on slides but failed in practice. Victor listened, dissatisfied. Daniel worked late, frustration etched into his face. One night, Daniel came home with papers spilling from his briefcase, his tie loosened, his shoulders heavy. Elena brought him tea and sat across from him at the kitchen table, the house quiet around them. "May I look?" she asked, gesturing to the documents. He hesitated, then nodded. She read slowly, carefully, her eyes moving with purpose. She asked questions. Why this supplier? Why this port? Why everything was centralized in the first place? Daniel answered, then stopped, realizing he didn't know all the reasons himself. Elena pulled out one of her notebooks and began to draw. She proposed rerouting shipments, diversifying suppliers, renegotiating with smaller regional partners who were being overlooked. It wasn't flashy. It was logical. "Where did you learn this?" Daniel asked quietly. "From watching," she replied. "People talk when they think you don't matter." Daniel brought the idea to his father. Victor listened. Then he asked Elena to explain it herself. She did, without embellishment or apology. The plan was implemented. It worked. Losses slowed. Delays eased. Confidence returned. Elena began attending meetings, first as an observer, then as a contributor. Some executives resisted, their skepticism thinly veiled. Marcus Bell openly dismissed her ideas at a conference, laughing about inspirational stories. 2 months later, one of her strategies undercut his expansion plans and secured Hale Industries a critical contract. The laughter stopped. At a major industry conference, Elena stood beside Daniel on stage. She spoke about systems, about efficiency, about the cost of ignoring people who do the invisible work. The room listened, not because of who she married, but because of what she knew. Marcus watched from the back, realization dawning too late. He had underestimated not just her, but Victor's judgment. When Hale Industries announced its strongest quarter in years, the headlines changed. The story was no longer scandal. It was foresight. At a private dinner, Marcus raised a glass to Victor, his smile tight. "You were right," he said. "We underestimated her." Victor glanced at Elena, then at his son, who now stood with quiet confidence. "Yes," Victor replied. "You did." Elena did not smile in triumph. She simply took Daniel's hand, grounded and steady, knowing that respect was never won through noise, but through time, work, and the refusal to disappear. The laughter did not burst out all at once. It crept in first, a few careless chuckles exchanged between men who believed they were witnessing something absurd, then it swelled, feeding on itself until it filled the room. It rolled across the long table of polished walnut, clashed softly with crystal glasses, and clung to the silk-draped walls like an unpleasant echo. Victor Hale stood at the head of the table, his hands resting calmly on the back of his chair. He did not raise his voice. He did not frown. He simply waited, allowing the noise to expose exactly what kind of people sat before him. "My son will marry Elena," he said when the laughter thinned enough to be heard. "The wedding will take place next month." For a moment, the room froze, as if the words needed time to translate themselves into something believable. Then disbelief cracked through the silence. "The cleaner," a man near the end of the table said, eyebrows lifting. "You mean the woman who works nights?" Marcus Bell did not bother hiding his reaction. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the side, laughter spilling freely. "Victor, this is a joke," he said. "You're talking about the woman who empties trash bins on the executive floor. Tell me this is some kind of social experiment." Elena stood near the doorway, a tray balanced in her hands. She had been instructed to remain there in case refreshments were needed. She had worn her usual uniform, clean and pressed, her hair pulled back neatly. No one had thought it necessary to warn her that her name would be spoken in a room like this, spoken not as a person but as a curiosity. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray. She felt the heat rise in her chest, but her face remained still. She had learned long ago that reacting only gave people more power than they deserved. "Yes," Victor said evenly. "That Elena." The laughter returned, louder now, emboldened by confirmation. People leaned toward one another, whispering comments they made no effort to soften. Words like embarrassing, ridiculous, and desperate floated freely. Several pairs of eyes slid toward Daniel, waiting for him to look ashamed. Daniel felt every gaze like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. He had known about the arrangement, had argued quietly with his father, had listened to reasons he could not easily dismiss. But knowing privately and hearing it announced publicly were very different things. His mouth went dry. He considered speaking, defending Elena, defending himself, but his father's calm certainty held him in place. Elena lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in concentration. She took in the room through her peripheral vision, the expensive suits, the polished shoes, the ease with which cruelty passed for humor. She committed it all to memory. Then, when Victor dismissed the meeting, she moved forward without hesitation, setting down cups, refilling water glasses, doing exactly what she had been hired to do. Not one person apologized. Not one person met her eyes. The story spread faster than Elena could have imagined. By the next morning, whispers had turned into headlines. Business blogs speculated wildly. Some framed the engagement as a scandal, others as a calculated publicity move. Anonymous sources expressed concern about Victor Hale's recent decisions. Marcus Bell's company released a carefully worded statement praising diversity while subtly questioning leadership stability at Hale Industries. Daniel felt the impact immediately. Calls flooded in, friends asking what was really going on, distant relatives offering unsolicited advice, partners hinting that this might not be the right time for unusual choices. Everywhere he went, people smiled too much and asked questions that weren't really questions at all. Elena kept working. She finished her shifts, clocked out, and returned to her small apartment, where the walls were thin and the furniture mismatched. At night, she sat at her narrow kitchen table and wrote. She wrote numbers, patterns, ideas. She had always done this. Watching how people moved through spaces, how decisions made at the top rippled downward. Cleaning offices had given her access to conversations meant for closed doors. People spoke freely when they believed they were invisible to those who mattered. When Victor arranged for her to move into the Hale estate, Elena packed her belongings into a single suitcase. She left behind nothing she could not replace. The house was larger than any place she had ever lived, its hallways wide and quiet, its ceilings high enough to make her footsteps echo. The staff observed her carefully. Some were polite, some distant, some openly skeptical. Elena greeted everyone the same way. She learned names. She asked questions. She never pretended she belonged, but she did not apologize for being there either. Daniel tried to talk to her, awkward at first, unsure of how to bridge the gap between obligation and something more human. He expected bitterness. What he encountered instead was composure. "This must feel strange," he said one evening, standing near the window of the sitting room. "Yes," Elena replied simply. But strange is not the same as wrong. There was no accusation in her voice. No demand. It